After winning gold at the 2024 Paralympic Games in Paris, David Abrahams faced the inevitable decline of his swimming career. Injuries and the rise of younger competitors pushed him to reflect on his journey. By the time he competed at his final Paralympics in 2028, David was no longer in his prime, but his passion for the sport was undiminished. Though he didn't medal, his final race earned him a standing ovation, a tribute to the resilience that had defined his career. In retirement, David became a coach and mentor, dedicating himself to helping young Paralympic athletes reach their full potential. He was an advocate for inclusivity and accessibility in sports, using his platform to inspire others. His legacy wasn't just in the medals he won, but in the countless lives he touched, proving that no obstacle is too great to overcome. David Abrahams' journey from a small town in Pennsylvania to Paralympic glory is a testament to the power of perseverance, and his story continues to inspire athletes around the world. David Abrahams' story begins in a small but close-knit town in Pennsylvania. His parents, Jonathan and Emily Abrahams, were not athletes themselves, but they were resilient, hard-working people who valued determination and integrity. Jonathan, an engineer by profession, was the kind of man who believed that no obstacle was insurmountable with the right mindset. Emily, a high school teacher, was nurturing and fiercely protective, always encouraging David to embrace his uniqueness rather than be limited by it. When David was born with a congenital limb difference, it was a moment of surprise, but not of devastation. His parents were determined from the beginning that David's life would not be defined by what others might perceive as limitations. Instead, they wanted to raise him in an environment that valued persistence, resilience, and self-worth. They believed wholeheartedly that David's differences would not hinder him, they would be the source of his strength. The Abrahams family was grounded in their community, and David grew up surrounded by love, support, and understanding. Jonathan, in particular, often said, "It's not about what you're missing, it's about what you make of what you have," a mantra that would stay with David throughout his life. Emily, on the other hand, nurtured David's curiosity and creativity, encouraging him to explore the world, ask questions, and embrace challenges with an open heart. From a young age, it was clear that David had an adventurous spirit. He was a child who never accepted no as an answer. Whether it was climbing trees, playing with friends in the park, or engaging in sports with his siblings, David never let his limb difference define what he could or could not do. His parents marveled at his fearlessness, but they also knew that the world beyond their home could be less kind. They worked hard to prepare David for a life where he might have to prove his worth again and again. But they never doubted that he would do just that. Jonathan and Emily instilled in David a deep sense of self-belief and a quiet confidence. They understood the importance of independence and never coddled him, pushing him to find his way even in moments of difficulty. It was this upbringing, rooted in love and resilience, that laid the foundation for the athlete David would become. However, growing up in a small town had its own set of challenges. While the community was generally supportive, David still faced moments of exclusion. Some children, unaware of his capabilities, would hesitate to include him in games. There were awkward stares, questions, and assumptions from both children and adults alike. But in these moments, David's family was his refuge. His parents were his greatest advocates, teaching him how to respond to adversity with grace, but also how to stand his ground when necessary. Jonathan and Emily also made sure that David had access to physical therapy and any resources that might aid in his physical development. However, they never treated his condition as something to fix. Instead, they always framed it as a unique aspect of his identity, something that made him who he was, but never something that would limit his dreams. As David grew older, the spirit of competition began to burn within him. He was particularly drawn to swimming, a sport that would come to define his future. Water, for David, felt like freedom. In the pool, his limb difference seemed to melt away, and it was just him, his determination, and the water. His parents noticed this passion early on, and though they had no expertise in the sport, they did everything they could to support him. His early days in the pool were not easy. David faced physical challenges, but his determination, much like the values his parents instilled in him, was unshakable. Even when he was overlooked for teams or underestimated by coaches, David's inner drive only grew stronger. His parents were always there on the sidelines, not pushing him to succeed but reminding him that success was possible if he wanted it. It was Jonathan's quiet strength and Emily's unyielding belief in her son that would form the bedrock of David's early life. Their dedication to ensuring that David had every opportunity to succeed, despite the challenges he would face, became the foundation upon which his extraordinary athletic career would be built. David Abrahams was raised to understand that he was born to defy expectations, not just the world's, but sometimes his own. And as he began his journey toward becoming a Paralympic athlete, his parents' unwavering love and belief in him would carry him forward, even through the most trying of times. David Abrahams was born on a rainy summer morning in July 2001. The hospital room was filled with the usual excitement and anticipation of new life, but there was an unexpected quiet when David arrived. His parents, Jonathan and Emily Abrahams, were instantly aware that their son was different. David was born with a congenital limb difference. His left arm was underdeveloped, ending just below the elbow. For a moment, the air in the room felt thick with uncertainty, and the nurses exchanged brief, concerned glances. But that uncertainty was fleeting. For Emily, the sight of her newborn son was filled with joy, not fear. She held him close, looking into his bright eyes, and felt a deep sense of clarity wash over her. This boy was going to be extraordinary, not in spite of his differences, but because of them. Jonathan stood beside them, his face calm but thoughtful. He was not a man easily rattled, and though he knew there would be challenges ahead, he was certain that David was strong enough to face them. From the very beginning, David's parents refused to let his limb difference define him in a negative way. They raised him as they would have any child, making sure he was never coddled or treated differently because of his disability. David grew up in a home filled with love, support, and the quiet, unwavering belief that he was capable of achieving anything he set his mind to. David's early years were filled with the kind of ordinary joys that mark childhood, running through fields, building forts with his older brother, and riding bikes with friends. But even from a young age, David knew he was different. The world around him often reminded him of that fact. He noticed the way people sometimes stared, or the hesitant looks other children gave him when he reached out with his left arm. But to David, these stares and glances were never discouraging. They fueled something deep within him, a desire to prove that he was more than what others saw. It was around the age of 6 when David discovered the water. His family had taken a summer trip to the beach, and while most children hesitated before wading into the waves, David ran full force toward the ocean. The water had a calming effect on him, like it was calling him home. As he splashed and swam, Jonathan and Emily watched in awe. David was more confident in the water than on land, moving with a grace and strength they had not yet seen. It was as though the water erased the limitations his limb difference presented on land. Noticing this, Jonathan and Emily enrolled David in swimming lessons when they returned home. He took to it immediately. There was something about the weightlessness of the water, the feeling of freedom it gave him, that made David feel whole. In the water, no one could tell that he was missing part of his arm. He was just another kid, swimming faster and harder than anyone else in the pool. But even in the pool, David faced challenges. His limb difference meant that he had to work harder to perfect his stroke, to find balance, and to generate speed with less propulsion. Early on, there were many moments of frustration. David, ever the competitor, hated feeling like he was at a disadvantage. His coaches, too, were unsure of how to train him. Most had never worked with an athlete who had a physical disability, and they struggled to adapt their methods to David's unique needs. There were days when David came home from practice in tears, frustrated that his body would not do what he wanted it to. Emily would sit with him, her arms wrapped around his small frame, and tell him that feeling frustrated was okay, but giving up was not an option. Jonathan, always pragmatic, would watch from the sidelines, occasionally stepping in to remind David that the only real competition was with himself. Despite the challenges, David's love for swimming never wavered. He worked harder than anyone else in his training group, often staying late after practice to work on his technique or to perfect a stroke. His coaches, seeing his dedication, began to push him harder, and slowly, David's frustration turned into determination. He learned how to use his body's unique strengths to his advantage, compensating for his limb difference in ways that no one had ever taught him. As he progressed through his early years in the pool, David started to stand out. By the age of 10, he was competing in local swimming competitions, often surprising other swimmers and their parents with his speed and skill. It became clear that David was not just a good swimmer, he was a prodigy. But there were still hurdles. When he first started entering competitions, David was often placed in able-bodied events, and though he sometimes placed well, the disparity between his physical ability and those of his competitors was stark. He would finish races with blistering times, only to find himself overshadowed by able-bodied swimmers who had no such challenges. It was during this time that David and his parents were introduced to the world of Paralympic swimming. The discovery of Paralympic sports was like a door opening for David. For the first time, he saw athletes who were like him, individuals who had defied the odds and turned their physical differences into strengths. Paralympic swimming offered David a chance not just to compete but to excel on a global stage. It gave him the opportunity to be recognized for his skill and determination, rather than his disability. As David transitioned into the world of Paralympic swimming, he found himself more driven than ever. He wasn't just swimming for fun anymore, he was swimming for a future that could take him all the way to the Paralympic Games. David Abraham's rise to prominence in the world of Paralympic swimming was anything but ordinary. By the time he entered his teenage years, David had become a force to be reckoned with in the pool, his name whispered with respect among his peers and coaches alike. But the path that led him from a small town in Pennsylvania to the world stage was filled with moments that would test his endurance, his resilience, and his unwavering belief in his dreams. It was during one of his first major competitions at the age of 13 when the world first started to take notice. Competing in a regional Paralympic event, David not only won his events, he shattered records. His power, speed, and technique were beyond what anyone had anticipated from a young swimmer with a congenital limb difference. But it was not just his victories that caught the eye of those watching, it was the way he carried himself, calm, focused, and fiercely determined. David had begun to swim not just for himself, but for something larger. He had seen the impact his victories had on others, particularly on young children with disabilities who watched from the stands. For them, David was proof that they, too, could defy expectations. And David took this responsibility seriously. He wanted to show the world that people with disabilities could not only compete but could dominate their sports. His performances in the pool were more than just races, they were statements. As his reputation grew, so did the expectations placed on him. By the age of 15, David had been invited to train at the U.S. Paralympic swimming trials. The thought of being surrounded by some of the greatest athletes in the world was both exhilarating and daunting, but David embraced the challenge. The trials were unlike anything he had experienced before. The pool deck was filled with athletes who, like David, had overcome physical challenges and now stood on the precipice of representing their country on the world stage. At the trials, David was one of the youngest competitors, but he did not let that intimidate him. He approached each race with the same quiet confidence he had carried since childhood. His coach, a former Paralympic swimmer himself, had recognized something special in David from their first meeting. Under his guidance, David's training had become more intense, more focused. They worked on perfecting every stroke, every turn, and every breath. David's coach would often tell him, "Talent will get you in the pool, but discipline will keep you winning." That discipline paid off. At the trials, David exceeded all expectations, qualifying for multiple events with times that rivaled the best in the world. He was officially named to the U.S. Paralympic swimming team, and with that came the realization of a dream he had nurtured since discovering the sport. David was now on his way to representing the United States at the 2020 Paralympic Games in Tokyo. The lead-up to the Tokyo Paralympics was a whirlwind of training, interviews, and media attention. David, always humble, kept his focus on the pool. He knew that the real work was still ahead of him. The attention was flattering, but it was the challenge of competing against the best in the world that drove him. He had been working his whole life for this moment, and he was not about to let it slip away. But then, as the world came to a sudden halt due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so did David's dreams of competing in Tokyo. The Paralympic Games were postponed, and David was faced with a challenge he had never anticipated: the uncertainty of waiting. The postponement of the Games was a crushing blow. He had been at the peak of his training, his body and mind perfectly in sync. Now, with the Games delayed by a full year, David had to find a way to stay motivated, to stay sharp, and to keep his dream alive. For many athletes, this might have been a time of despair, but for David, it became an opportunity. The delay allowed him to dig even deeper, to train harder, and to refine his skills. He worked relentlessly in the pool, often spending hours at a time perfecting the smallest details of his strokes. He also took the time to focus on his mental game, working with a sports psychologist to strengthen his mindset and prepare for the emotional challenges that awaited him. When the 2020 Paralympic Games were finally held in 2021, David was ready. He stepped onto the world stage in Tokyo with a calm intensity, knowing that everything he had gone through, every challenge, every setback, had prepared him for this moment. His performance at the Games was nothing short of spectacular. He swam with a precision and power that left even seasoned competitors in awe. In event after event, David not only medaled, but he also set personal bests, proving that he belonged among the world's elite Paralympic athletes. But while the Tokyo Games were a triumph, David knew his journey was far from over. His heart was already set on Paris 2024. With the taste of victory still fresh, he returned home more motivated than ever to continue his pursuit of greatness. In the years leading up to Paris, David's rise continued. He broke records at national and international meets, securing his place as one of the top Paralympic swimmers in the world. His name became synonymous with resilience and excellence, and he was featured in countless media outlets, from sports magazines to television interviews. But no matter how much attention he received, David remained grounded, always returning to the lessons his parents had instilled in him from a young age: hard work, humility, and the belief that anything was possible. By the time the 2024 Paralympic Games arrived, David was no longer the young, wide-eyed swimmer who had competed in Tokyo. He was a seasoned athlete, a leader on the U.S. team, and a role model to countless young swimmers around the world. As he prepared to step onto the biggest stage of his career, David knew that everything he had worked for had led him to this moment. David Abraham's journey to Paralympic stardom was never a straightforward climb. Behind every medal, every broken record, and every moment of triumph lay a series of challenges that tested his resilience, both physically and mentally. His career was filled with highs that pushed him toward greatness, but also lows that threatened to break his spirit. Each setback, however, became a stepping stone on his path to success, and in those moments of struggle, David found the strength to rise higher than ever before. After his stellar performance at the 2021 Tokyo Paralympic Games, where David secured multiple medals and achieved international recognition, he was on top of the world. He was young, talented, and driven, with a future that seemed limitless. But success in athletics is never guaranteed, and in the years that followed, David would face some of the most difficult moments of his career. The first significant hurdle came in the form of injury. In early 2022, during an intense training session, David felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. At first, he shrugged it off as soreness from overtraining, but the pain persisted. After weeks of discomfort, David was diagnosed with a shoulder impingement, a common but serious injury for swimmers. The diagnosis meant that David would have to take a break from the pool, something he had never done willingly. For someone like David, whose entire life had been built around his training and the water, being sidelined felt like a cruel punishment. His doctors recommended a period of rest, followed by physical therapy, but David struggled with the idea of stepping away from the sport he loved. At just 21 years old, he was already facing the prospect of an injury that could derail his career if not treated carefully. Those months out of the pool were some of the darkest of David's life. Without his daily training routine, he felt adrift, unsure of how to channel his energy and focus. His identity as a swimmer had been so central to who he was, and now, with his future in the sport uncertain, David found himself questioning everything. There were moments when he wondered if he would ever be able to return to the same level of competition, or if this injury would mark the beginning of the end of his career. But, as he had done throughout his life, David turned to the lessons instilled in him by his parents. His father's words, "It's not about what you're missing, it's about what you make of what you have," echoed in his mind. He had overcome challenges before, and he knew that this injury, though painful and frustrating, was just another obstacle to overcome. He threw himself into rehabilitation with the same dedication he had shown in the pool. Each physical therapy session became a race in itself. David set goals, pushing his body to heal, determined to come back stronger. While his physical recovery was a challenge, the mental aspect of his rehabilitation was equally difficult. David had always been mentally tough, but this injury tested his patience and his willpower in ways that competition never had. He worked closely with sports psychologists to manage his frustration and keep his motivation alive during the long, grueling months of recovery. By late 2022, David was cleared to return to the pool, but the road back to his peak form was far from easy. His shoulder still required careful monitoring, and every stroke reminded him of the fragility of his body. He had lost precious time in the water, and as he returned to competition, it became clear that his injury had taken a toll. His times were slower, and for the first time in years, David was not standing at the top of the podium. The disappointment was palpable. David, who had once been unbeatable, now found himself struggling to keep pace with competitors he had previously outswum. The media, which had once hailed him as a Paralympic prodigy, began to question whether his best days were behind him. David heard the whispers of doubt, both from outside and within. There were moments when he questioned whether he could truly return to the level of greatness he had once achieved. But it was in these moments of doubt that David's true character shone through. He refused to accept mediocrity or to let the injury define his career. Instead, he doubled down on his training, working with his coaches to adapt his stroke to reduce the strain on his shoulder. He focused on his technique, finding ways to be more efficient in the water without sacrificing speed. David knew that his physical condition had changed, but he also knew that his mind, his drive, and his heart were as strong as ever. In 2023, David faced another setback when he narrowly missed qualifying for the World Para Swimming Championships. It was a devastating blow. He had been so close, but not close enough. The defeat stung deeply, and for a brief moment, David considered whether it was time to step back, to accept that perhaps his time as a top-tier swimmer had passed. He had already achieved so much, more than most athletes could dream of, and yet, the thought of leaving the sport without giving it everything he had was unbearable. During this time, David's support system became more important than ever. His parents, always his biggest supporters, reminded him that setbacks were not failures, but opportunities to grow. His coach, who had stood by him since the beginning of his Paralympic journey, refused to let him give up. "You've come back from worse," his coach would say. "This is just another race, and you've never quit a race." Fueled by the desire to prove to himself, and to the world, that he still had more to give, David made the decision to continue fighting. He set his sights on the 2024 Paralympic Games in Paris, knowing that it would be his greatest test yet. The months leading up to Paris were a grind. David trained harder than he ever had before, pushing his body and mind to the limit. He reworked his swimming strategy, focusing on shorter bursts of speed and more efficient turns, playing to his strengths rather than trying to replicate the swimmer he had been before the injury. The pressure was immense. David was no longer the young, rising star. He was now a seasoned athlete, a veteran in the sport, with the weight of expectations bearing down on him. The world would be watching in Paris, wondering if he still had the ability to perform at the highest level. And though the doubts lingered in the back of his mind, David never let them consume him. In the final days of training before the games, David felt a calm settle over him. He had been through so much, injuries, setbacks, and moments of despair, but he had never lost sight of his love for the sport. The water, which had always been his refuge, was once again his sanctuary. He knew that whatever happened in Paris, he had given everything to the sport he loved. The morning of the 2024 Paralympic Games in Paris was electric with anticipation. The sun cast a warm glow over the aquatic center as David Abrahams stood poolside, taking in the scene that had become both familiar and awe-inspiring to him. The scent of chlorine filled the air, the steady hum of the crowd building as spectators filled the stands. Yet, for David, time seemed to slow. This was it. The moment he had been working toward, fighting for, and dreaming of since the day he first felt the water carry him all those years ago. But this time, it was different. This time, the stakes were higher. He was no longer the young athlete hungry for his first taste of victory. He was now a seasoned competitor, someone who had faced injury, defeat, and doubt. His journey to Paris had been far from smooth. Every stroke he swam had been earned through pain, perseverance, and relentless determination. The Paris Games would not just be about medals or records, they would be about redemption. In the days leading up to his race, David had felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had returned from injury, narrowly missed qualification for the World Championships the year before, and now the entire sporting world was watching to see if he could still perform at the highest level. He was no longer the fresh-faced underdog, but a man who had battled back from the brink, and the pressure of that narrative was almost palpable. Yet, standing there in the quiet moments before his race, all of that pressure seemed to dissolve. As he adjusted his swim cap and goggles, David's mind went quiet. He thought of the long hours of training, the early mornings, the sacrifices he and his family had made. He remembered the days spent in physical therapy, pushing his body to heal, and the moments of doubt when he wondered if he would ever swim competitively again. But he also remembered why he was there in the first place, his love for the water, the pure joy of swimming, and the feeling of freedom that had always come with each dive into the pool. The event was the men's 100-meter breaststroke, David's strongest event and one he had dominated earlier in his career. But this time, the field was tougher than ever. Among his competitors were world record holders and young rising stars eager to make their mark. David knew he was no longer the fastest on paper, but what set him apart was his mental toughness, his years of experience, and the knowledge that he had overcome greater obstacles than any of them. As the whistle blew and David stepped onto the starting block, he could hear his heart pounding in his chest. His muscles tensed in anticipation, and then, in a split second, he dove into the water. The roar of the crowd faded into the background as the cool water enveloped him, and for those few moments, it was just David and the race. His strokes were powerful and precise, cutting through the water with an intensity that belied the fatigue his body had felt just months before. Every movement was calculated, his turns were sharp, his breathing rhythmic. The months of reworking his technique, of adapting his stroke to accommodate the lingering effects of his shoulder injury, had paid off. He was not just racing the other swimmers, he was racing the limits of his own body, pushing it beyond what he had thought possible. At the halfway mark, David was in third place. The two swimmers ahead of him were setting a blistering pace, and for a moment, it seemed as though his dream of standing atop the podium might slip away. But David had always been a closer, and in the final 50 meters, he found another gear. His body screamed with exertion, but his mind was calm and focused. Every ounce of energy, every bit of strength he had left, was poured into those final strokes. With 25 meters to go, David surged ahead, his arms slicing through the water with a ferocity that surprised even him. The crowd's roar was deafening now, but all David could hear was the sound of his breath, the steady rhythm of his strokes, and the beating of his heart. As he touched the wall and looked up at the scoreboard, time seemed to freeze. His name flashed across the screen, and beside it, the number 1. He had done it. David Abrahams had won the gold medal. In that moment, everything he had worked for, everything he had fought through, was validated. The noise of the crowd came rushing back, and David found himself overwhelmed with emotion. Tears welled up in his eyes as the magnitude of what he had accomplished hit him. This was not just a victory for him, but for everyone who had believed in him along the way, his parents, his coaches, his teammates. This was for the young boy who had defied expectations, for the man who had battled injury and doubt, and for every athlete who had ever been told that they were not good enough. As David climbed out of the pool, the cheers of the crowd were deafening. His parents, Jonathan and Emily, stood in the stands, tears streaming down their faces. They had watched their son's journey from the very beginning, from the moment he first discovered his love for the water to the moment he stood victorious on the world's biggest stage. They knew better than anyone how much this victory meant. During the medal ceremony, as the national anthem played and the gold medal was placed around his neck, David allowed himself to finally breathe. He had proven to himself, and to the world, that he was still capable of greatness. The doubts, the injuries, the setbacks, they all faded in the glow of this moment. David was not just back, he was better than ever. But more than the medal, it was the knowledge that he had persevered through adversity that filled him with pride. This was not just a victory in the pool, it was a victory of the human spirit, a testament to what can be achieved when you refuse to give up, no matter the obstacles in your path. As he stood on the podium, David looked out at the crowd and saw the faces of young swimmers with disabilities, watching him with wide eyes and hopeful hearts. In that moment, he realized that his triumph was not just his own, it belonged to them as well. He had become a symbol of possibility, proof that no matter what challenges life throws your way, you can rise above them and achieve greatness. After the euphoria of his gold medal victory at the 2024 Paralympic Games in Paris, David Abrahams returned home a hero. The media hailed him as one of the greatest Paralympic swimmers of his generation, and his story of perseverance became an inspiration worldwide. The weight of his triumph, however, was more than just personal. It carried the hopes and dreams of countless athletes who, like him, had been told they were different, that they had limits. In Paris, David had proven that there were no limits, not for him, and not for those who dared to dream. But as with all athletic careers, the high of victory eventually gave way to the inevitable passage of time. After the 2024 Games, David continued to compete, but his body had taken a toll. Years of relentless training, the shoulder injury that had once nearly ended his career, and the natural wear and tear of an elite athletic lifestyle began to catch up with him. In the months following Paris, David noticed that recovery took longer, and the bursts of speed he had once summoned so easily were becoming harder to sustain. David's next major competition was the 2026 World Para Swimming Championships. Though still competitive, he was no longer at his peak. The field was filled with younger swimmers, hungry and full of energy, just as he had been years ago. David secured a few podium finishes, but he could feel the shift in the water. The next generation was taking over. The victories did not come as easily, and while his love for swimming never waned, David began to realize that his career as a top-tier swimmer was entering its twilight. It was a difficult realization, one that every athlete must face at some point. For years, swimming had been David's identity, his purpose. To walk away from the sport that had shaped his life seemed unimaginable. But as he grappled with the idea of retirement, he also began to reflect on all that he had accomplished. He had defied the odds, risen to the pinnacle of his sport, and inspired countless others along the way. His legacy, he realized, was not just in the medals he had won, but in the lives he had touched. David's final competition came at the 2028 Paralympic Games in Los Angeles. Though he knew he was no longer the favorite to win, he wanted to end his career on his own terms, competing at the highest level one last time. The build-up to the Games was emotional, not just for David, but for his fans, teammates, and the wider Paralympic community. He had become a symbol of resilience and determination, and his retirement marked the end of an era. In Los Angeles, David swam with all the heart and passion that had defined his career. Though he did not win a medal, the standing ovation he received from the crowd as he touched the wall for the final time was more meaningful than any podium finish. As he climbed out of the pool, the water glistening on his skin, David felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had given everything to the sport he loved, and now it was time to step aside and let the next generation shine. Retirement, however, did not mean stepping away from the world of swimming. David transitioned seamlessly into a new role as a coach and mentor for young Paralympic athletes. His own experiences, the highs, the lows, the moments of doubt and triumph, became invaluable lessons for the next wave of swimmers. David was not just teaching technique, he was teaching resilience, mental toughness, and the importance of believing in oneself, even when the world tells you otherwise. His coaching career quickly blossomed. David became known for his ability to connect with athletes on a personal level, understanding the unique challenges they faced as para-athletes. His story, and the way he had overcome adversity, made him a beacon of hope for athletes with disabilities who might have doubted their potential. He often reminded his students that it was not about how they started, but how they finished, a lesson he had lived through every race of his own career. Beyond coaching, David became an advocate for the Paralympic movement, working tirelessly to raise awareness and visibility for athletes with disabilities. He spoke at schools, community events, and conferences, sharing his story and championing the importance of inclusivity in sports. His goal was to ensure that future generations of Paralympic athletes had the resources, recognition, and support they deserved. He believed that the world needed to see athletes with disabilities for what they truly were, world-class competitors, not defined by their limitations, but by their achievements. David also became a driving force behind efforts to improve accessibility in sports, working with various organizations to create more opportunities for young athletes with disabilities to get involved in competitive sports. He often reflected on his own journey, how discovering swimming had changed his life, and wanted to ensure that every child, no matter their ability, had the chance to find their passion. In time, David's legacy grew beyond the pool. He was honored with multiple awards for his contributions to sports and advocacy, and his influence reached far beyond the Paralympic community. His story became a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to let the world define their potential. Schools across the country began using his story as an example of perseverance, and his name became synonymous with courage and determination. As the years passed, David's influence remained strong. Though he was no longer competing, his presence in the world of Paralympic sports was deeply felt. His former students began making their mark on the international stage, many of them citing David as the reason they believed in their own potential. His impact on the sport, and on the lives of those he had coached and mentored, was undeniable. David Abraham's legacy, however, was more than just the medals, the victories, and the records. It was in the lives he changed, the barriers he broke, and the belief he instilled in others that they could achieve greatness, no matter their challenges. His journey from a small town in Pennsylvania to the heights of Paralympic glory was a testament to the power of perseverance, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. As David looked back on his career, he knew that his greatest triumph was not any one race or medal, but the knowledge that he had helped pave the way for others to follow in his footsteps. His life had been defined by overcoming adversity, and in the end, that was the legacy he was most proud of.